This video may appeal to no one, but it is for everyone. In many ways, that's exactly what poetry often aspires to be for everyone, though often enough, it's something that in time has become lost in the seeking of attention that surrounds us always. And poetry is so often quiet on the page, so often flat for many. It ends up feeling like an ancient form of writing that no longer applies. And so the poets and the poems get lost, and they appeal to fewer and fewer. And yet the thing that is so special about poetry is that it is an attempt to appeal to everyone. It's an invitation to us to see something different. Maybe that something is something in ourselves. Maybe that something is something out in the world. It's very often in poetry detailing the world in a singularly subjective way from the eyes of the poet. And when we've lived a lifetime seeing things only as we are, it can be nice to at least attempt for a little while to pay attention to things in a different way, to pay attention to things how another person would attend to it. I think the desire for a lot of teachers when they try to teach poetry is they really want to offer up that particular feeling that they felt themselves when they read a great poem and it really spoke to them, brought something out of them that they didn't expect. The desire then becomes an almost desperate need to share that experience. But of course, in communicating something, we then get locked down into the barriers of communication, and that requires dissecting things. What it then becomes is, in order to teach the poem, we have to dissect it cold. And of course, the process of dissection is always a process of decision making. You're deciding then suddenly what aspects to dissect and pull out, and you are pulling it out of its context. And we dissect those things separately, but then it makes the poem again just butchered and broken apart into little pieces. So as I said at the start, this video is possibly not going to appeal to anyone, but it is for everyone. It is a video to attempt to communicate what matters to me about poetry, only what matters to me. It doesn't have to be what matters to you, and it may not matter to anyone who watches this. But poetry has a particular feel to me, and I want to communicate what I look for in a poem and why that matters to me so much. And perhaps it's an invitation to you to just try looking for the same. And what that is merely just looking for the familiarity of self in another person. That seems obvious, that seems very straightforward. But my particular relationship to poetry stems from this very unusual situation of having a poet father who pushes his work out for the public and therefore has to mold himself around a public while also attempting to speak something true about himself. It is that distinction between the public-facing aspect of who he is and the more private yearnings of what it is that calls him to poetry that makes it so that when I was younger and hearing him speak his poetry at readings or reading his poetry myself, it was so meaningful how much of that poetry was actually true, how much was pointing to something in himself that I saw as his son. And I saw really for what it was in all of its messiness, and how the poems communicated that in a real way. And it actually felt like there was something really genuine happening here in terms of a connection with the public. And it's a little bit different than writing fiction. You know, fiction has the distance of character and the arc of plot. And that creates expectations and attention around satisfaction of those characters and satisfaction of that plot. And then some of the honest elements that must be in fiction can be drowned out by merely allowing ourselves to only map onto the parts that we notice in the outline, as opposed to the parts that are deep within the details of the context. Poetry has that too. Poetry can pull from many images of things that we seemingly feel we know, and it is that familiarity that brings so much comfort. But I want to just push and reflect on the personal in poetry. When it comes to a poem that's trying to be more personal, trying to communicate the self, the music then becomes merely a background to the self, to this central point of being honest about something for a while. One of the first free verse poems that I really enjoyed was by Walt Whitman. I'm sure that's the poet that a lot of people first start to enjoy poetry with. He has these inscriptions in his great book, Leaves of Grass. And I want to read just the first one. it says, "Oneself I sing, a simple, separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. Of physiology from top to toe I sing. Not physiognomy alone, nor brain alone is worthy for the muse. I say the form complete is worthier far. The female equally with the male I sing. Of life immense in passion, pulse, and power, cheerful for freest action formed under the laws divine, the modern man I sing." And you do hear the singing in the very first line. You hear, "Oneself I sing, a simple, separate person." And you can notice that kind of back and forth, a simple, separate person. There is alliteration. There's a kind of consonant bounce in the midst of the words. And that creates a little hint of music in spite of the free verse structure of the poem itself. So there's always music in poetry mixed in. But of course, that poem is a declaration of aim in the overarching series of poems that make up the Leaves of Grass book by Walt Whitman. And that is the aim, to sing of myself. Now, why rely on song? Why would song be the best way to communicate the self? And what does poetry have to do with song? Well, song gives you immediate emotional connection. You've probably noticed this. You can feel the sadness in the song between 2 to 3 notes. As soon as 2 to 3 notes occur, you can feel the arc of sadness in the song, or you can feel the lilt of joy emerging. There is the relational quality in song that is immediately felt in emotion. And words don't quite have that same immediacy. Words need to be comprehended first. Words are sort of signs pushing us in the direction of some intended effect. And there is a delay in the process of us registering the proper way to interpret that sign. But music is so immediate in its emotional striking. I'm thinking about the sound of poetry because my dad is a poet, and one of the earliest introductions to poetry was hearing him speak his poems out loud. And there's such a strange music to his speech while speaking poetry. And when I was really, really little, I'm talking like 5 years old, I would try to mimic how he would speak when I heard him say his poems in a crowd. And I think it fascinated me partly because it was such a different version of him, a different version of his speech. I knew how he talked normally, and then suddenly when he's reading poetry, there was a heft that was emerging out of his lungs. He was sort of breathing deeper and projecting farther. There's actually video of me at around 5 or 6 making poems. And all I was doing was mimicking my dad's speech and then just looking around at the details in our house. And like literally the video has me looking out the window and saying things like, "The white puffy clouds emerge down, they go down, down into the blue of the sky like waves of water. Down, down, mother, do you see the clouds?" And of course my mom is the one filming me. And I say, "Oh, the clouds that drift and come and go. How happy I am to be here too and to see it with you." And things like that. And I was just playing with sound. And I was a little kid and I don't really know poetry. I don't know any of the history of poetry, but I knew the sound. And I was just playing and playing and playing with it. I think about that video. It's on videotape. I don't know that I'll be able to easily transfer it into this video, so you might not see it. But the thing to know is it's fascinating for me to watch because there's little moments in little tiny me when I'm just talking about the clouds and the water and just sort of freewheeling my way through, that it is poetry that I am pretending to do, but I'm pretending with earnestness and honesty. I'm trying my best to sound like my dad. There's little things that are revealed to me as I make this effort about the clouds and the water, all these little images that I'm just latching onto. And in the moment of creating them, they're desperate images. It's just whatever comes to my mind as quickly as possible. Much like right now, I'm saying whatever words come to my mind as quickly as possible. But in that process, you do discover something out of your taste. You kind of make the discovery of what matters to you. When you look out a window, what do you pay attention to? In that case, when I was a little kid, there was something more beautiful about the sky than the blocks of buildings directly in front of us. And I was seeking beauty because I was attempting to perform. And in seeking beauty, I discovered what I find beautiful. It feels to me like sometimes poetry is just that. You have a poet figuring out how to fill up a page. And there's a struggle in filling it just with yourself. So you look up at your horizon of what's around and you start to pick from outside of yourself. It's perhaps overwhelming to purely put yourself there. But of course, you are always there. You are the selector. You're the one discerning what matters. And as a reader of poetry, that is such the eloquence of it. It's not just the diction, it is the eloquent choice making of diction, of what matters in your words. What do you want to put down onto the page? I want to read one of my dad's poems because I think it illustrates a turning point for me in understanding poetry. It was my dad's attempt to be very public about something very private. And it was something I knew about because I saw the worst of my dad. This was very soon when my dad began writing poetry. He had just stopped drinking alcohol regularly. He was an alcoholic prior to that point. And prior to me being born, he was a drug addict. And there's all sorts of things about my dad that are very harsh and horrible from the outside looking in. And he wrote about how horrible he was. And he put it into a poem. He puts it into many of his poetry. Just this feeling of regret, the feeling of seeing yourself from the outside and thinking how destructive I can be. And it was when I saw that my dad was putting this part of himself into his poetry, it made me feel like there was something really special about poems, that a poet would put a part of themselves out like that. And the thing that was so fascinating is I could distinguish the public-facing aspect of the poem, the ways in which it is a poem attempting to please to a certain extent, even if that pleasure is derived from something horrible. But I could also see the truth in it, and it felt really true. And it made me curious how much of poetry can be true like that. The poem is called Victory Victoria, My Beautiful Whisper. And Victoria is the middle name of my sister. She's 14 years older than me. So she grew up with him when he was in the midst of his addictions, in the midst of the worst of himself. And he writes a poem to her as his daughter, a kind of sorry, but it really is just a kind of capturing of an image of who he was. So I'm going to read this. Victory Victoria, my beautiful whisper. You are the daughter who is sleep's beauty. You are the woman who birthed my face. You are a cloud creeping across the shadows, drenching sorrows into heart seas to rain. Victory Victoria, my beautiful whisper. How as a baby you laughed into my neck when I cried at your leaving after your mother and I broke up. How at age 3 you woke me up from stupid, so I would stop peeing into your toy box in a stupor of resentment and beer. And how later, at age 5, when I moved in with another woman who had a daughter about your age, you asked, how come she gets to live with Daddy? Munica, these words cannot traverse the stone path of our distance. They cannot take back the thorns of falling roses that greet your awakenings. These words are from places too wild for hearts to gallop, too cruel for illusions, too dead for your eternal gathering of flowers. But here they are, weary offerings from your appointed Father, your anointed man-guide. Make of them your heart's bed. And of course, he can't fully ask for forgiveness for the mistakes that he's made. He can only just offer up some honesty in his description of it. And there's something disgusting about that image of him peeing into my sister's toy box. And I have memories of the worst parts of him that were similar to that. And when I can see those pieces in that poem, it does bring me some comfort. This idea that there is a space of writing that is outside of some of the falsifying that we require in media attention. The ways that media needs to grab our attention and hold us, and often the easiest way to hold us is to give us comfort. And poetry can sometimes give us discomfort and attempt to hold us in that place. And there are some, maybe it's just a bias of my own, that find discomfort comforting in a different kind of way, because at least it feels more honest. There's this piece written by David Foster Wallace called E Universe Plurum. It's in his collection, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again. And it's just his essay on the nature of voyeuristic looking, of being a writer and trying to dissect people as they are. But then how so much of us become voyeurs, or at least have this feeling of being voyeurs, watching people without them knowing whenever we watch television. And it gives us this feeling like, oh, look, we're watching a room of people interacting. And look, this is how people interact. I can model my own interactions off of that. I can be like the heroes in these stories. But of course, the point that he makes in this essay is that it is not voyeuristic at all, because all of those actors are fully aware that you're watching. And so they are playing up your expectations. And there is a satisfaction in that. And then television also begins to shift away from playing it up, and it starts to be fully self-aware of the ways in which it plays with your expectations. And that is part of its tongue-in-cheek playing with you, is to be meta, to make commentary about itself as it tries to play up the honesty of itself. And then that becomes an additional play. But at no time is it truly honest, because it is always aware of you as an audience. I only bring up that essay because it is something I think about a lot, as so much of the media we consume is so deeply self-consciously aware of us all the time. Right now, I'm aware of you. I'm aware of you watching me, and I'm thinking about my words as I say them in order to construct them presentably. And I'm continuously thinking of you. And so I am myself. I'm being honest as I can, but I am still putting on a show for you. And I think about this showing all the time. You know, we're always, there is a drive for us to show ourselves. In social media, we have to present ourselves via a profile. And that profile, we of course want it to be honest, but there's an obvious separation between the public self and the private self. And it seems impossible not to reinforce that barrier between the two parts of who we are. I think about that right now as I'm talking to you. I'm trying to talk to you about poetry, about how poetry can be honest in a way that feels different. But I'm also trying to connect with you on poetry. And as soon as I know that I need to make a connection, I'm becoming fully self-aware about your perception of me connecting with you. And now I'm changing in adaptation to expectations of what I think you're going to respond with as you see me attempt to connect with you. And it feels inescapable, the barrier that starts to pop up. But then I go back to poetry. I'm thinking about poetry so much right now because I have a friend on YouTube who has a new poetry book coming out. It's called Blue Remembered Star. He wanted me to host his book launch, which should happen on his channel the same day that this video comes out. And so I've been reading his poetry a lot, and I get some of that feeling of that kind of reminder of how poetry can be honest in a way that feels refreshing, even though it is presenting itself. Even though right now I am presenting myself to you, and you're going to see me edit out all of my long pauses, which I pause all of the time, and you don't see how much I'm pausing in between my sentences. There's so many sentences where I stop and I'm just looking off and just thinking, what do I want to say next? And I cut that out. And that is a kind of dishonesty, but it's also a dishonesty in service of communicating more what I want to say. And I see that when I'm reading my friend's poetry. I had really become a friend with him. I talked to him on video chat. We have talked about things way beyond his poetry, and it's so nice to talk to him. And then I read his poetry, and then I see bits of him in it. And I see the little bits where he's very honest about himself. I see the self-conscious bits in his work. And then I also see the self-conscious parts of myself in his work. And then it makes me remember, oh, that's what poetry can be sometimes. Poetry can be really wounding. It can be an open wound. You kind of cut yourself and let people see under the skin for a little while. And there's ugliness there. But it also is so familiar because we all have that same body underneath our skin. We all have that sameness beneath whatever the cover is that we place up. He actually has a poem about that distinction, the ways that we can connect with someone but then not really connect with them. He has a poem about his friend Ash when he was growing up and how they connected with each other on music and smoking weed and just kind of drifting with each other for a while. There was also aspects of his friend's life that he never really got to know. He only got hints of. And he was too young to recognize that distance. And he was especially too young to recognize the times in which his friend was attempting to bridge that gap. That poem is from his first collection, Vertigo to Go. And I'm just going to read it very briefly. The poem is called Ashley. Our 15-year-old hands cut it from a plastic Coke bottle, spray painted it blue, and fitted it with tinfoil. We named our homemade bong Pandora. Thick white smoke straight into our blood. In Ashley's garage on Saturday nights, feeling like suburban teenage soothsayers, we grooved to Hendrix. We raged to Cobain. Then we laid back on neon beanbags, and the space between each thought stretched out like cosmic toffee. And with blood-struck eyes, we gazed through dust-addicted cobwebs, ragged and abandoned in the rafters, to the luminous, tantalizing future pinned like a shiny silver ring to the nipple of the world. But I grew up and fled that two-stroke town, lost touch with that boy and that vision of a world without injustice. And now I wonder, where is Ash? I asked around, tried to find a contact number or Facebook account, but all I found, another memory long buried, in pubescent wreckage of ecstasy, purple haze, Ninja Turtles, and bad grades. Memory, rising like a pimple, small and painful, of his voice in that damp garage saying, "Since my dad died, I feel I'm breaking apart." And I had been too busy riding the radiant final wave of innocence behind my eyes to see his hands shaking. That poem touched me immediately because it is exactly like a friend I had when I was growing up. I grew up in low economic conditions. Prior to my dad's success as a poet, we weren't doing particularly well. And so all of my friends were like me, struggling, with a family struggling. And I had a friend named Joey who I would hang out with exactly the same way as the poet Bren talks about his friend Ash. As an adult, I can reflect on all of the details that should have mattered to me when I was young but didn't, of how destructive he was, how destructive I was. We would literally break windows around a house for fun. That's how stupid we were. But also how uncomfortable we were and how insecure we were. But I remember him having moments where he would try to connect with me, and I was so closed off to connection. It felt so awkward to connect because maybe it was a kind of vulnerability that you shouldn't show in a space where other people would hurt you for being vulnerable. And I would shut him down when he would try to connect with me. And that poem was so interesting because it was that same familiar feeling of this kind of masculine structuring of disconnection and friendship being a kind of barriered thing. And it is so nice to just have a poem, a short piece, a poem that just talks about the burying of feeling that we impose onto each other sometimes because we want to maintain face to a certain extent. Right now, I'm still maintaining face with you as a YouTuber, booktuber, even though I'm trying to be honest. I just want to remind you of that. I'm trying to be honest, but I can feel it. I'm aware of you watching. But then Brent Booth Jones in his poetry book doesn't just talk about Ash seeking connection. At this point in his life while writing this book, he actually really tries to connect. He tries to see from his friend's eyes. And there's a falseness that has to be inherent to that because he can't really see from his friend's eyes, but he imagines it. It's a second order observation. That's a term from Nicholas Luhmann, a sociologist, a philosopher. And it's him seeing himself from a second observation point and imagining self-consciously what he must be like. So he imagines from the eyes of his friend Ash. And that is the poem Dreamscape. Ash awakes. I step out of a trance. Moonlight fills the room to brimming. The weed has worn off. My brain is porridge. The garage smells of bongs and vomit. You're asleep, but your eyelids flutter, scanning a shifting dream vista. You, me, Jimi Hendrix, making frozen yogurt snow angels again. Molecules of memory gathered like blood to a bruise. I see my dad's face, his eyes closed in rapture, playing me his Woodstock records. To shake the pain, I look at you, snoring lightly on a beanbag cushion, nails painted black, SpongeBob t-shirt. Do you feel this tension between us? How soft are your moonlit features, delicate as moth wings. You tease, you confuse. There is a tiny fold of skin across each eyelid where faint red lightning strikes the sealed horizon of your unfathomable life. And just like the tension between line breaks, there's always a tension between us and someone else. And poetry attempts to stay in the tension. Notice in that poem and the prior one, we're talking about moments in time. We're not talking about hours and hours. We're not moving perpetually forward like fiction has to move forward and forward to reach an endpoint of plot. We are staying in a moment, and we're staying in the tension. And that tension is this friend Ash looking at the poet, and the poet is imagining what they would be thinking looking at him. Again, there has to be some falsity, but there is a genuine desire to connect that poets sometimes communicate. And that's one of the special things about poetry that this video is attempting to talk about. And it's attempting to talk about it in a very disconnected, disoriented, confused, rambling way. I always ramble. There's so many comments that talk about how much I ramble, and I'm self-conscious about how much I ramble too, because I know that you're watching. But then the poetry also rambles. And maybe that's my bias. I like rambling a little bit. I dislike the lack of rambling in so many videos. It's so tight. It's so attentive to you. It's always attending to you, serving you attention in bite-sized chunks. I guess this is my attempt to talk about poetry like poetry, to talk about it in a way that stays in the tension. I want to stay in that tension. Maybe that communicates something special about poets generally, or about writers generally. This is a point that David Foster Wallace makes in that essay I mentioned earlier. Writers are oglers, right? They like to watch and observe, and they're trying to capture behavior of people. They're trying to bring something true out in the text. At least some writers are. And poets are very desperate to kind of capture something profound, something deeply true. And it is that desperation that also creates a distance from the thing they're trying to capture. And it's a kind of ironic bind that they find themselves in. Maybe that's one of the things that's special about reading poetry. If you find a poet who's really striving to be honest, the specialness is just in the striving, just trying again and again to just be real for a little while, to be real and to communicate it effectively, which then of course leads to some degree of falsity. But it is superficial falsity, where beneath there is something genuine being attempted. The real inspiration for this video is Bren Booth Jones has a poem in his most recent collection, the one that's coming out, where he talks about being a poet trying to sound profound, but he doesn't talk about it directly. He just communicates the awkwardness of himself trying to be profound. And that felt deeply familiar. That feeling of striving so hard to say something meaningful, and then to have the reality of the world remind you that you're not as clever as you think you are, or you're not as in tune as you hope to be. And yet it's the fact that you're hoping to be in tune, it's the fact that you're hoping to say something that actually is special. Here's his poem, Lovesick in the Park. We lie in the green, white, and rose tumble of fresh and fragrant snow, of blossoms and cold spring sun. April in Holland, fumes and flowers, liquid light. Drunken bumblebees drone dizzily. Systemic cherry blossom downpour, I say. A disconsolate ant hikes the hillock of my shin. Surrounding the greenish, lovesick vacuum of this park, the city spills. Systemic neon, chrome sneer, trend and tumor, mutating into muzak, melting into molten miasma, melding muddled motes. The whole goddamn glittering shit show we forced the earth to swallow. McAmsterdam and its million weed-riddled visitors. Digits fizzle in the binary guts of the machine. That's not what systemic means, you say, unbuckling your satanic boots and laying back beside me. Above us, treetops writhe in April light. Above the trees, Boeings grope madly through the blue, deliver raving tourists into red hues and frightful highs. You smell of white wine and desire. An ant shoulders a crumb up the analogy of my ankle. Oh, little Sisyphus, must we keep up this systemic shopping? Little kids nearby on the grass are absorbed in skywriting, their fingers tracing caverns where the ozone used to be. They stitch their hearts into loopy, dissolving letters. a message stretched into airy thinness that says something like this: Dear Mr. President, please keep our grandkids a freeze-dried leaf. Make history believable. And the obvious word that repeats again and again is systemic. You have this poet trying to say something deep, profound. He's grabbing a word that is often attached to some kind of profundity of society at large. Systemic. And you see people who use the word systemic, they sometimes overuse it or misuse it. They sort of find the grandness of it matching whatever it is that they feel, and there's a kind of desperation, and we can make fun of it. We can look at them and say, how stupid. They don't know how to use this properly. And this poet formulates the acting out in his writing of a poet trying desperately to be profound, and then also crashing down to ground when someone beside him makes the point, that's not what systemic means. You don't know this word that you're using. But what I find beautiful about the poem, what I find beautiful about the act, and why I don't think it's fair to make fun of people who misuse words, is there is a poet, there is a person trying to connect with an idea. The idea is systemic, it's big, it's over top. There's something deep about what they desire, and they're just trying to connect with it, and they're fumbling along the way, but at least they're moving somewhere. That's what I value so much in pretentiousness. That's why I like some of these pretentious books. I've gotten comments about how pretentious I am, about how I sometimes read things that, oh, you're just trying to seem smart. I feel odd because, of course, I am not just trying to seem smart, I'm trying to be smart. I care about these books. I like authors who are desperate and try too hard, because it feels not as cleaned up as so many other things can feel. And I want you to think about the value of reading text that is a little less cleaned up, where rather the cleanness, the carving out along the letters, is more in service of something true as opposed to just being in service of entertaining you. And poetry can be very unentertaining. It can be very convoluted. It can be dense. It can be frustrating in the obfuscation of its meaning. But then if someone is obscuring, there is something genuine in the act of trying so hard. And what is being shown about this act of just desperation? What am I showing you by trying so hard in these silly videos? I keep releasing these videos week after week, and I do feel kind of odd about it because I don't like being a public-facing person, and yet I made this weird choice to make a public-facing account and to do this thing where I'm talking about books, and books to me have always been personal throughout my whole life, and then suddenly I'm trying to connect with complete strangers, and the strangers are connecting with me, and then they feel somewhat attached to my ideas, and that's that parasocial quality of this weird relationship. And then I do feel guilty about that, and then I also think, but I do want to connect about something personal, and then I think, well, what is the value in connecting in that way? And maybe the value is there's just not a lot of spaces where people are just trying to be kind of embarrassing, kind of overly earnest. That's the end of that essay by David Foster Wallace. He talks about how maybe the real way to rebel from the world is just to be kind of earnest, just be really real about something for a little while. And people are going to mock you for it, and it's going to be silly. And poetry is not cool anymore. There's nothing cool about being a poet. There's nothing cool about writing poetry. Poetry is the go-to example of someone just navel-gazing and being stuck in a space. Perhaps the second most example would be philosophy, right? It's just someone just winding away, spiraling down within their own inner thoughts. But I guess I feel a disconnect because I don't understand why that isn't extraordinary, that people try that. And I don't understand why we don't love that more. I said at the beginning, this video may appeal to no one, but it is for everyone. And the invitation that it offers is to go back to poetry again, just like I started to go back to poetry. Because it felt really nice to just read poems closely for a while, and not to read them in order to dissect them for an essay, for a teacher who just wants to know that you can comprehend, but rather to just know them closely for yourself, and to see bits of yourself in it. Perform the pathetic fallacy. Who cares? No one's going to know. Just see yourself in it, and just see the person and what they're striving for, and value that for its own sake. And maybe that's what this video is about. No one cares about poetry. This will be probably the video that gets the least amount of views. But I hope that those who did watch it, they pick up a poetry book immediately after, and just go back into poetry for a little while. It is so much more comforting than the noise that is so desperate for our attention. Poetry, rather than attending to us always, is contending with the tension that the poet felt in the midst of the problem they're attempting to describe. And you can struggle through that with them. There's something really nice about that. I hope you didn't mind struggling with me in this video too. This video is a public service announcement. Read some poetry. You might get something out of it for yourself.